Welcome to Kelly House. Kelly House presents a Sunday afternoon, the last Sunday of the month from April through October. And it's a way of sharing and preserving the history of the coast. On your chairs, you have a questionnaire which deals with the program in general, not any specific speaker, if you could fill those out, and if you have any ideas for any programs. And the little green card lists who we have coming up. Today, we have Hough. He's a maritime historian and author, and a volunteer at Kelly House, past volunteer since he's moved. Today, he'll be talking about schooners and steamers on the Redwood Coast. Before we begin, Louis has his program broken up in segments, and he'd like to do a segment, then if there's any questions or comments. And also, Marty wants to promote his Walks for Heritage Days.
Hi, as you probably know by now, if you haven't heard it, we're in the middle of our Heritage Days. Lots of activities countywide. Here in Mendocino, on Fridays, Saturdays, and Sundays, we're doing walking tours here out at Kelly House. Jeff is taking the Fridays, and I'm taking Saturdays and Sundays. You may have seen my alter ego, J.D. Johnson, who was the major builder in town, also the undertaker. House you in this life and the next. And next Saturday night at 8 o'clock, we will bring some of J.D. Johnson's friends to life. Jerome Ford will be there, Augie Giza, the newspaper man, Cinderella Wallace, the working girl. And so if you want to go on that, meet here at Kelly House at about 7 o'clock, 7:15, 7:30, and then we'll walk over to the cemetery for that. And it's a full moon cemetery tour. So come check us out. It's going to be a lot of fun. Now I guess we'll turn it over to Louis.
Will there be baying at the moon?
Absolutely.
Yeah, I'm Louis Hough, and I'm glad that you're all here, and I presume that our company is all assembled. I think that was a Shakespeare line, something to that effect. Anyway, what I'd like to do first off is say that this is as much your afternoon as it is mine. So I would like to have participation, but not at every second so that you're interrupting me in mid-sentence. But I certainly will be happy to have you all involved. You're here obviously because you have some interest in waterborne traffic and, how would I say, the commerce of this community and those on the Mendocino coast. So anyway, I would like to have people, even Bruce over there, and all you other historians, to correct me if I misstated something. And I do not want to, get too much into statistics and facts and all that sort of stuff. So we'll kind of keep it easygoing, although there will be a few things and no test and everything. So we'll sort of get going now, and we'll begin with page 1. This was done by my associate. His name is Palsied Hand. And, a watercolor representation would be much better of our coast. But what I wanted to do is say, we really love it here. And that is because of the forest, our rugged coastline, the ocean. There's all kinds of lovely things going on. And what I wanted to point out is we have the forest here. Some years ago, probably 150 years or more, a poet wrote something about the forest primeval. This is the forest primeval, the murmuring firs and the redwoods, bearded in moss and in garments green, indistinct in the, I think he said twilight, I think it's more like fog. Anyway, but these particular three elements, the forest, the rocky coast, and the ocean, they're all essential elements of what we're going to be talking about, water transportation to this frontier. But the county coastline, Mendocino County coastline, is just about 100 statute miles. You can imagine that. Sure, you can zip along and do that in an hour, but it was a lot different a long time ago. That was when it would take many, many hours to come up from San Francisco and into a port here. We like living here, and we think this is fabulous because we're remote. We don't have lots and lots of people streaming in here as tourists. But let's say 150 years ago, when the whole maritime began, those people were remote and they liked it, but they also didn't have much other than agriculture and wildlife to sustain them. If they needed shoes or coffee, sugar, flour, all those things they really could not make here, nor could they have harnesses, tools. Everything had to come largely from San Francisco aboard ship and then get hoisted up the rocks, and that's about anywhere from 50 to 80 feet. Unless, fortunately, there was a port, say like Mendocino Bay, where they could come in. It was a little easier, but they still had to contend with the high bluffs. Okay. Ocean port. Pardon me. It was remote then, but those were hardy frontier people. Today, we get, really annoyed. Worse than that if the power goes out. We're wimpy compared to the people then. We even have a weekend event here called Crab and Wine, when we can crab and whine about the power going out, or running out of water, or whatever. Well, so much for the introduction, except I wanted to point out that everybody, the doctor, the druggist, anybody who was up here, even the Chinaman, I know that's not a good term, the Chinese laundry people, they had to get their soap. So just about everything you wanted had to come up by boat. Now, we are going to move on to the next event, which is olden times. I don't know when they invented Dramamine or whatever, but it was not a friendly ride for people who had motion sickness. You got that?
Yep.
Okay, fine. The first thing we're going to talk about is the boats. The schooner, which is called a fore and aft rig. And you have some examples around here. This, they say fore and aft because everything was, the sails were all along the midline of the ship compared to square sails as we have on the other. These were the essentially the three kinds of vessels that did, because I don't know whether we're all going to be able to, I'll try to talk descriptively. But this was the most frequently used vessel. Albert Jackson, in this very informative book, which is available here at the Kelly House, but not for sale. Anyway, he mentioned something like about 284 vessels that were involved in calling at ports here on the coast. Mostly they were the schooner, a lot of them were brigs and barks. Okay, we mentioned this first vessel here perhaps, well almost, was called Flyaway. When Meigs, famous Harry Meigs, heard about all these wonderful redwood trees and this enormous potential money-making forest up here, he sent his 3 notable gentlemen, I believe it was, well, they're over there in that picture.
Gerald Ford, E.C. Williams, and
Mr. Smith.
Kelly.
Kelly. Ship's
Anyway, the story is they came up on this schooner named the Flyaway, but it was either too rough or something, they weren't able to get ashore. Is that true, Mr. Levine? Or you don't know?
I wasn't there.
Okay. There were about 4 gentlemen living here. William Caston, who had a little log hut, not a block or so away from where we are right now, maybe 2 blocks, and 3 German brothers named Hegemeyer were living up Big River. At that time it was called Bull Dam. Don't ask me what the translation of that is, but anyway, the 3 gentlemen went back and gave Mr. Meigs a very glowing report on, wow, is there timber possibilities up here? Things were beginning to thin out a little bit south, so south of here, logging and so forth was at quite a head start. I may not be right about that, but anyway, the potential in the forest up here was enormous, and so the 3 gentlemen went back and reported to Mr. Meigs. The reason for that was the wreck of Frolic up here around where the lighthouse is. This lighthouse, Cabrillo, just a bit north of that. This ship from the Orient, Frolic, and you almost all have heard about that. And those guys, some of them, I think the captain and the others, were able to row south to San Francisco. You can imagine that's quite a tour. Others travel by land, but anyway, they reported, and Meigs got the idea, let's come up here and really check this out. And that's where the schooner Flyaway comes in. Now, Sovereign, you're probably not all that familiar with that name. However, according to a maritime historian, name escapes me, Toker, was reading these old Alta California newspapers, and he discovered an item that this vessel, Sovereign, brought lumber from Albion, the sawmill at Albion, and landed in, I think it was July 4th, 1852, just when the Ontario, which was carrying Meigs and a whole lot of men and machinery, were coming north to establish what is usually thought of as the first sawmill. However, down at Albion there was this old sawmill running on tide water. When the tide came in, it turned a water wheel, and when the tide was ready to go out, they had a belt attached to the water wheel. They turned it over so it continued, and that's how they ran their saw. Anyway, they cut lumber or loaded lumber aboard the vessel, the schooner Sovereign. Now, meanwhile, coming up the coast with all the equipment for sawing comes Meigs' bunch, again with
Captain Lansing,
Yeah.
E.C. Williams, and William Kelly, ship's carpenter.
Thank you.
And Meigs, however, was not on the Ontario, in case you may have
Oh,
said that.
no, there
He
was
never
a
came
leak.
up here.
Never came up here.
No, it was a leaky old ship left
Oh, yeah.
over from the gold rush, and you got it for a cheap price. Anyway, they all came here and got here safely after kind of protracted. This is probably stuff you already know. Anyway, then they built the mill out here on Point, sank the Ontario with stones and stuff, because they thought they could corral the lumber, or the logs, logs coming down from a big river. The darn things wouldn't, they're like cats, you know. They would go off, and they wouldn't get corralled near their sawmill. The whole thing became kind of a, so they decided to move, to rebuild, put the sawmill over on the flats on the other side of the bridge.
There had two mills going actually at one point.
Good.
The one on the point was still operating.
Yeah.
I don't want to interrupt.
They still use the Point to load the vessels, but they had a much better way of collecting the logs with the booms, and they send them down the river. Okay, the Glen Oak, I guess that's how I don't think that's a S. So Glen Oak, on March 17th, 1853, carried the first lumber sawn here in Mendocino, and I used to have the amount, it was something like 151,000 feet. You sort of know what a board foot is. I forget. Well, actually, it's a square, 1 inch thick, 1 foot, 1 foot. Okay. Then, now we come to ships like the Larke. These are what they call square riggers, and these sails are usually at 90 degrees on spars or yards. And this is a two-masted vessel. Well, the Larke has 3 masts and a 4.5 mast sail called a spanker, and these are jibs, as you probably well know. Anyway, a bark called the New World on April 4th, 1853, was the second vessel to carry Mendocino Meigs lumber to San Francisco. And then later in September, the Jan Hendrik was the first, that was the same year. In September, carried lumber to Sydney, Australia. So that was the first offshore shipment of lumber. And so that's pretty significant, because they'd only been here, they'd only started shipping in March and April.
So that all happened in 52?
53.
53?
52, they got here and built the sawmill. But it takes a while for them to have logged, floated everything down the river, get the machinery functioning properly, teething. It's a process like teething. Okay, so that's essentially the vessels, the sailing vessels that we had on the coast. This, I'm not going to make much of a fuss over that, because who's interested in maps and dates, but it gives you an idea of the coast. These are just a few of the major ports. At one point, there were somewhere between 60 to 70 lumber loading dog holes, as they call them. For instance, at Little River, they had a wharf and about 3 different apron chutes. You can see a picture over here of an apron chute, and another one. This one happens to be at Point Arena. So, these were the miles measured from the ferry building. I took the nautical miles and transposed them into statute miles as we, so you have Bear Harbor near the top of the county, 182 miles from the ferry building, and Wallala at 99. And so much for our coastline, and I didn't want to get into a lot of trouble. I mean, I could tell you when some of these were established, if you're interested, but
Well,
How about the one at Wallala?
did I misspell it?
No.
when was it established?
According to what I discovered, it was 1862.
If Mendocino was established in 1852, how about the mill in Noyo? That was there first. Was that there earlier or not?
Noyo, they had it 1852. McPherson, I think,
Yeah,
was
right.
running it.
Pearson, whatever.
Anyway.
What was the earliest one? I mean, nothing earlier than the.
The earliest one was in Albion.
Yeah. Now, that's a story in itself. Captain Richardson, who at that particular time was the port captain of Yerba Buena. Yerba Buena being the name before it became San Francisco. And he married the daughter of the Grand Hidalgo, or whatever he was, the chief guy in San Francisco. And he was given this marvelous land grant that ran, I think, practically from Point Arena up to Albion. And Albion got the name because apparently it reminded Captain Richardson of the White Cliffs of England. So Albion, the old name for okay. I'm getting
It's a good story.
Keep going. It's a good story. But he established that water wheel sawmill where they turned the belt over to make it work. And
So that was before the gold rush then?
Yes.
well, a sawmill was,
Mexican.
There's a
The
Mexican
saw-
land grant that Richardson.
yeah, he got that, it was about 1846 or something like that. It's quite a story, and there's books written about William Richardson, who, I think it was William, and he jumped ship, a British ship in San Francisco, knocked around and something like that. And,
Jump ship in Yerba Buena.
okay.
Was that a whaling ship?
No.
No, it was a whale of a ship, though.
Okay.
Okay. So some of these are interesting because, well, we'll talk about that shortly, because they had wharfs.
Anchor Bay between Point Arena and Wallala was I don't know if there was a wharf there, that's a really nice little spot to get into. I don't know if it was Fish Rocks, you know where that is?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
Oh, well, as I said, there was almost 70 loading places, and sometimes they had more than one chute. Okay, next. Here's your schooner. This is the common schooner. We're gonna run through a little bit. What were they like? I used this one, Emma and Louise, which was built at Little River by Thomas Peterson. He built it in 1874. It was 90 feet long, 26 feet wide. Now that's a pretty full breadth of ship. The depth was 7.3 feet. I'm not sure whether that was the depth of the hold, but you can see that it was pretty much, lumber could be stowed down practically to the bottom of the ribs here. And it was 89 tons. We'll get, what is a ton? In maritime parlance, it is a unit of measurement. It has nothing to do with weight. A ton is 10 feet by 10 feet by 10 feet, 100 cubic feet. So it's space, and when they say it's 89 tons, that meant you could put 890 feet of lumber, more or less. So if you could imagine a shed, where do I have that? Here. Getting ahead of myself. If you can imagine a shed, a storage shed, 10 feet long, 10 feet wide, and almost 9 feet high. That's about the capacity of Emma and Louise. Okay, the cost of per ton, or actually they measured it by 1,000 board feet. You get all this mixture of numbers. It's almost as bad as today. With, you know, today we have all kinds of forms of measurement, but regardless, the cost to build this vessel was about $20,000 for Mr. Peterson and his crew, and he probably had only 8 or 9, maybe 10 people working with him, and it was. So you can imagine he built 14 vessels at Little River, and then all 34 schooners. Some of them were 3-masted, most of them were 2-masted. They built them, well, several places. This first one was built at Russian Gulch, if you can imagine. Then they built them at Noyo, and here in Mendocino, at Navarro, Whitesboro, which is Salmon Creek, and at Cuffy's Cove. And I'll be darned if I've ever seen a picture or anything that describes where Cuffy Cove you could build a ship. You look at it, you go down to Queenie's for breakfast or lunch. You go, you try to look, and you can't see anything when you're looking to see where at Cuffy's Cove. And it was a major port, oddly enough. You know, people coming up and things like that. Quite a ride. Anyway, now, the reason these schooners were so cool is the printing gets pretty tiny here. And you know, squeeze it all. It had a wide beam and a shallow draft, as I mentioned, and a lot of room for the lumber, and a crew of about, these schooners would have a crew of about 4 to 7 men. That's about what it took. And a skipper who knew his way around, and these ships were considered pretty handy, the little 2-masted ships, about 100 feet long. Some were less. They grew longer over the years. But they were really very handy little vessels. And you can see the bobble. You probably, if you saw that flyer, you saw this picture. I mean, my gosh, they could put them into places like that. This, it says, is when it was wrecked, when the bobolink was wrecked across the bay at Kent's Point, but it almost passes for showing you how arduous it could have been to get your ship in there, hook it up with lines to the rocks and so forth. And something else when it comes to seamanship. They always, and what leads me to believe that this is truly a wreck, is she has her bow into the shore. Normally they would this other picture, be facing out, because if a storm came up or they got wind of it, they could get out as best they could. Other vessels, like here, are riding out of pretty heavy seas in the bay. I believe this is Electra, which was one of the vessels built by Peterson at Little River. Also in a storm here, this ship lost her mainmast.
The bark.
Oh, it's a 3 minutes.
A bark, yes. Good, you learned, or you already knew.
It's a brig now, though, right?
At any rate, about by 1905, they weren't building much in the way of sailing schooners. By that time, it was the steam schooner who had supplanted. Let's talk about the means of loading lumber while we were sort of at it. One way was lighter, a barge, which the lumber was loaded on the barge, taken out to the schooner, and then loaded a second time onto the vessel. Pretty arduous when you consider the fact that you'd have to hand up one board at a time. And not only that, they had to do one board at a time to load the lighter. So pretty soon they invented what they called the trapeze or apron chute, by which one board at a time was down to where the boat was offshore. And you can see again, this is a neat picture of one of the ports, if you want to call it a dog hole. That's Nip and Tuck. They had some neat names like Nip and Tuck and Rough and Ready, and but mostly they went by the gentlemen who owned it. They would get a lease from the county to operate a loading facility. So usually it was Iversons or names like that that were the who owned the facility. The lumber was essentially, mostly it was railroad ties. Back in the woods or close to the shore, hearty souls were taking logs and splitting them. They saw them arduously to length, split them into railroad ties, or there could be a whole number of things. I have a list here somewhere. I had a list. Well, anyway. Sir?
They were railroad ties because they discovered that the top half of the tree shattered and it couldn't make lumber.
Oh. You mean it would shatter when they...
When it hit the ground, it would shatter, so they had to make railroad ties, shakes,
Sticks.
Okay,
fence
yeah.
posts,
Grape stakes, as we
Grape
call
stakes.
all kinds of...
Shingles.
Shingles.
shingles, yeah.
Hey, back to the chute, that would be a hard job to be on the boat and catch the board when it came down.
Yes.
Oh, God, yes.
That was the catcher would have a tough one.
Actually, it was a clapper. No, that's what they had, they had
A
a stopper.
break.
It was a break.
There was a
Yeah,
guy here who had a device by which he could,
Clap it.
clamp, like, here comes the board, he could stop it, and it would be hanging over the deck, and then when it was time, he could push it over, and the mate or deckhand catches it, and then passes it perhaps to somebody down in the hold. What a job, because these, many of you ever lifted a railroad tie? I have, after it had dried out significantly. They're heavy. And a good guy, a good
Young
seaman,
Swede.
yeah, he would carry two of them.
Yeah.
Oh.
Wow.
But it's still board by board, they loaded. Then came the wire chute, and that was quite a development because a whole bundle package of lumber could be sent by wire out to the ship and physically lowered into the hold. Or later, after the hold was filled, they would load the deck. But so you'd have a whole bundle of lumber by dimension or grade, things like that, so that it would be not necessarily by consignment, but it could be that the agent in San Francisco, for instance, said, okay, we want so many board feet of lumber, and they could almost set it up so that they would be for consignment. But I think that's probably way down the pike in time. However, the wire chute was a neat device because it was almost like a continuing line. The ship would come in to port and they'd fish up the wire off the bottom, and by a whole complicated means of anchoring the vessel and attaching themselves using the mast, they could deliver lumber very promptly. Wouldn't take much time before they would be the empty well, there were sort of chains and wire, but that would be this kind of a device here, only could come back empty or with passengers. Talking about hardy people, as I mentioned earlier, these were pretty hardy folks.
Billy, how many ports had wire chutes?
How many?
Yes.
Oh boy, I don't know.
We know there was one up here.
Yeah, and they were using wire chute, and they still had some apron chutes too. I would imagine that there were probably, this is a guess, 50 or so. The loading facilities passed from perhaps one owner to another, and there was all kinds of, it would be a real job to try to sort it out as to who or when and all that sort of. We do know that by 1893 there was a pretty, what they call the Panic of 1893, which was quite a financial crisis for this country, and at that point an enormous number of these facilities were out, and let's see, about 5 years later, 1898, the large big outfits were taking over. For instance, in 1905, Union Lumber Company, which is the predecessor of the Georgia Pacific Mill up in Fort Bragg, as we knew it, bought out three of the major lumber mills, Glen Blair, Mendocino, and Little Valley. Who knows much about Little Valley?
It's
other
north,
than-
it's north of Fort Bragg. Yeah, it's above the Glen Blair, actually.
Yeah, okay.
On the Point Creek.
So the ports diminished considerably in number by that time, and I want to talk about wharves for a moment. There were about 10. Bear Harbor had one. There was one at Usell, Fort Bragg, Little River, Albion, at Whitesboro, Navarro, and at Point Arena. But at Point Arena, it was for other freight. Very little lumber ever went off it was lifted off of that wharf, and most of it, you can see it here. I believe this is Point Arena. that's the wharf, but this is how they were loading lumber. It came down an enormously high bluff there. If you've been to Point Arena, you may notice on the north side that's pretty high, and that the lumber came down to one unit like this, and then along and then out to the ship. It's pretty, not as spectacular as the facility up at Rockport, where it went by, the lumber was lifted up in a package. Actually, they were what they call cants, which is just a log squared off. Another term was squared. But they would lift up a whole bundle of these cants, and then it would be like about a 1,500, 1,200, 1,500 foot ride out to another tower. These were great big, huge redwood tower, and that was on a rock off the shore line. And then they would that load would be lowered down onto a railroad car and shoved along the top of the rock, and then sent by wire to a ship. That was the brainstorm of an outfit called Fink Buying Guild, who put that operation together. In 1925 was that trapeze, I think, is the, or high line, high line as they call it. That was the beginning of a 5,600 mile journey to the sawmill, which was in Mississippi. It was a catastrophic thing that happened. Maybe some of you remember a story I wrote for the Kelly House calendar about Rockport. It's about a year or so ago. I had a 3-part story or something, 2 or 3. They went bankrupt because they had to handle the lumber too many times. It would go aboard a small lumber schooner, which took it down to San Francisco at a place called California City, which is near Tiburon and Belvedere. There it was loaded again onto a big ocean-going steamer, which took the lumber, the cants, to Gulfport, I think it was. And then it got on it for another 90 or 100 mile train ride to the sawmills. They made the miscalculation at Rockport that they could bring the big ocean-going steamers right in to this loading facility, these big towers and highline and gizmos and so forth. Gizmos. Yeah. But then they found out nobody had really checked the depth of water. And they couldn't bring, could hardly bring the Santa Maria or the Pinta or the Nina into the, but anyway, they could get steam schooners in there. But they had to re-handle, or whatever it is, what's the term, Like I said, this business of having handled the lumber over and over again. First of all, it left the mill, which is almost a mile inland at Rockport, come down, going up and over and out onto the rock, and then onto the little steamer, and the little steamer has to be unloaded. And they found that they couldn't even lift the lumber from the little steamer directly into the holds of the big steamer. Their engineering crew really needed, I don't know, somebody with a little bit more foresight. So much for Rockport. That lasted for about 2 years before it went. Many years later, another outfit came in and Rockport came alive for the 3rd time. It had started in 1876 when fellow named Miller took the equipment, his sawmill equipment, which was down somewhere on the Sonoma coast, and he just took all of his machinery and crew and everybody and set it up there at what was then called Summer Harbor, because it was fierce. The storms that roll, the ocean that rolls into Rockport, of course, even today, was pretty tough. And so shipping lumber was tricky. But anyway, this guy Miller ran this Rockport operation. Of course, at that time it was called, the harbor was called Summer Landing or something, and it was called Cotoneva, which was a creek there, Cotoneva. I imagine most of you have driven up to Leggett on Highway 1. You go past Rockport, oh, you know, I think there's one old building or something left, but it was a booming town at one time. Railroads going back into the hills. And, anyway, we were talking about wharves. There was an amazingly long wharf down at Navarro. They just saved the inn down there, I understand it. Captain Fletcher's inn. And they had quite a sawmill there, and the lumber left the sawmill, went across the Navarro River, and wound out along the North Headlands. It's where it's Highway 1 wiggles up and comes up to the top. Down below, they had this railroad running out and then out onto a long wharf. That all went belly up around 1891, 1892. They had difficulty and were never able to get the show back on the road. I think there was a terrific fire and this and that. And that's the story of a lot of sawmills, was destruction by fire. Think of bad, you can run away, but if you're on a wooden ship and it catches fire, that's another story. Okay. Going on to the next gizmo is the steam schooner. Around the room here, there are several. There's a great model of the Walpama back there, and a foreshortened version of the Casper number 3. That was Emery Escola's model. I remember seeing it at his home, and it couldn't have come to a better place than here. So often these ship models get hidden back in the library, but that's fine. I was delighted when I turned up today and saw that they had all these goodies out here, all these pictures, even the Cabrillo Lighthouse. Okay. Let's talk about steam schooners. The big thing had a propeller. That meant that it was independent of wind and could make its way up here. If it was going to make a direct trip, say, to Mendocino, it could make it in about 15 hours. While if you're in a sailing ship, you're tacking back and forth, beating up the coast against the prevailing winds. Okay, sailing when you're going south because you have the wind pretty much behind you, but I'm not a sailor, so I don't know all the niceties of sailing. Anyway, it was very much like the sailing schooner, except it had machinery and everything was aft. So you had a large open deck area. It had a high forecastle. This is where the deckhands were housed, their accommodations. Here over the engine boiler was the skipper and probably 3 mates and the engineering crew, the chief engineer and the men who shoveled coal and watched after the engine, which is, I mean, the engine's going 24 hours a day. You had to have somebody watching it. So it got to be an expensive thing, go faster, it was more expensive, but since it could deliver the lumber on a fairly regular basis, the cost of maintenance, the crew, coal, and whatever incidental expenses, they're not incidental, but should I enumerate other ones? I was having breakfast this morning at the Little River Inn, and I went in there and saw the cost to build, I can't remember the name of the damn ship.
Seafoam.
Seafoam, yes. It was about $23,000 to build her. Now she was, she had passengers. She was one of the vessels. Most of the steam schooners did not. People didn't want to be bothered with passengers. They were pretty much more of a nuisance than. It wasn't much income to be had by. What was it, about $3-5, depending whether you came steerage or on first class, which wasn't much. A lot of times you went into your room and the decks and the bunks 3 high. And the top one was called Aunt Mary. That's a complicated story that I've never been able to really understand why it got the name Aunt Mary, but it had something to do with a woman who wanted to come up and visit her Aunt Mary. And I forget, anyway. Let's get back to what was so cool about the steam schooner is it was independent. It was much easier to dock and maneuver around and get under the wire when they were loading. And so it could be loaded promptly. It steamed pretty promptly, traveled pretty promptly. And they carried sails, see, furled. But most skippers hadn't given up the idea that sails were important. You might get into trouble and you know, the engine breaks down, you might still be able to not necessarily proceed with great alacrity, but you were able to steady yourself so that you weren't rolling around getting into trouble. And so the sails were sometimes used for that very purpose, was to steady the ship when she was going up against prevailing winds. I think I mentioned that the engines and boiler, fresh water and coal were all kept back aft. There was a pretty easy loading, a wide area in which to load, and the masts and booms then became cargo handling. They could have a steam winch, and that took a lot of the arduous back-breaking, bone-wrenching, or is it bone-wrenching and back, whichever it is. So the guys were, really exhausted. Now the crewmen and often some of the mill hands or people on the at the loading facility, particularly wharfs, and even here guys from shore would ride out, get on the ship, and they would help handle lumber. The story of longshoremen and unionization of the of longshoremen, even sailors. It's a very complicated, long, involved story, and it essentially worked out that the steam schooner, or the steamship companies were more powerful than the unions, till Harry Bridges came along in about 1941 at the head, about the beginning, just before World War II, and really put teeth into it, and the whole maritime union thing became powerful. There was a really severe strike one in 1934 and in 1936. Shipping was paralyzed. For people like Union Lumber, they had a railroad, so they weren't dependent. Certainly not by that time. Though I'm jumping ahead a little bit of the story, because the Depression pretty well finished off a lot of lumber mills, and more than virtually ended ocean shipping. To give you all the details would be kind of cumbersome, but it was just, there wasn't work, there was no demand for lumber, or it was quite minimal, and an enormous number of these steam schooners and the sailing schooners, those that were still left, were just rotting away in places like on the estuary that separates Oakland and Alameda, and other mud flats, San Pablo Bay and so on. It was just littered with ships that were never going to sail again, and they just sort of rotted away. Anyway, I think that's pretty much the story of the steam schooner. And okay, we've run through about an hour of talk here. Another thing, this is the very last chart. So, don't worry. By the old 1920s, we were down to very few points of shipping. Point Arena, Greenwood, that expired around 1930, as did Albion was also finished off. Casper, the Casper Lumber Company, survived after the war, and let's see.
1955, 1955.
Yeah, it was around 1955 that the ships had pretty well finished their participation in lumber shipping. The Rockport operation had started up again just before the war. But they were shipping everything, trucking their lumber down to Fort Bragg, and it went over by way of the California Western Railway. We know it as the Skunk Line. And same with Union Lumber Company at that time. Casper was still in operation, but everything else had died. Now these other points, they're going to play a part in the stories that I'm going to be reading shortly. There was a lighthouse at Point Ray, another at Point Arena, and the last one at Cabrillo, which was 1909, I think it was. They just had their 100-year celebration at Cabrillo. What the lighthouses had too were these musical things, that they were foghorns, which went boom. But when you couldn't see the light, you could hear the sound. And I think I'm going to read this story. Just before we finish, I want to tell you, the Mendocino Mill came to life briefly in August of 1938. It had pretty much died as of 1929. Avast ye mating.
Yeah,
Shiver my tent.
I will. Great, thank you.
Yes. What's in your coffee? Okay. We recommence. I wrote a story a while ago for the Beacon. It was called Current Events, which is sort of the joke, but anyway. So if you don't mind my reading things, we'll go pretty quickly. Skippers knew to put their vessels well offshore when it began to blow. Captain Madsen of the wooden steam schooner Jewel told his first mate, stand off a mile or so until morning. Secure in the knowledge that all was well, Captain Madsen went to bed, or bunk. Before dawn on the morning of January 13, 1899, the mate heard breakers pounding. With a violent wrench, Jewel struck the rocks at the north head of Casper Cove and ripped her wide open. A strong current had gripped Jewel and relentlessly pushed her to destruction, while the mate and lookout in the dark remained unaware of the danger. It was a common mistake to misjudge the set, or the direction and strength of current toward shore, and it was a fatal error. Distress signals summoned help, the ship's whistle wailing while mill hands and townspeople gathered. Through the early morning gloom, they saw Jewel breaking apart. It seemed to take forever to throw a rope from shore to the ship and rig a sling. Then, one by one, the hands were pulled to safety, all but the cook, washed overboard and missing. Immediate attention focused on the first assistant engineer named Horn. Caught and jammed by a shifting pile of lumber on deck, Horn broke his leg and was feeling great pain from internal injuries. Others, suffering minor injuries, accompanied Horn to the Casper Infirmary. Out in the bay on a pile of debris floated the cook, who was hauled into a small boat. Happily, all were accounted for. Jewel and her lumber cargo were soon battered into kindling. Lost to the Casper Lumber Company was a steamer valued at $30,000 and a cargo of redwood at $4,000. Lost was the crew's shipmate engineer Horn, who died because of a failure to reckon the power and push of the onshore current. Mid-afternoon of Monday, January 17th, 14 of Jewel's survivors sailed from Fort Bragg aboard the steamer Noyo, bound for San Francisco. With 13 other passengers, they crowded indoors, whatever it is on a ship, indoors, to avoid a chilly rain, comfortable in the newly renovated accommodations. Noyo was the jewel of the Union Lumber Company fleet, with Captain W.R. Daniels commanding. Ironically, this jewel fell afoul of the same misjudgment, ignoring the presence and power of an onshore current. 4:30 the next morning, it was foggy and drizzling. Noyo was in 3 hours of docking in San Francisco, and most aboard were tucked in their bunks. Noyo's cook arose early to prepare a splendid breakfast, for which the Union Lumber Company vessels were well known. Captain Daniels himself and two mates were on the bridge and unaware that a strong northeasterly set was shoving Noyo onto Duxbury Reef. Daniels reckoned they were 3 miles offshore. But the wrenching of timbers emphatically switched to tell of his miscalculation. The seas worked Noyo right over the ledge and back into they were on the rocks. The seas worked Noyo right over the ledge and back into deep water. She began listing to starboard as the water rose. Everyone came on deck, fully dressed but without breakfast, and clambered into the ship's 4 lifeboats. Miss Royal from Fort Bragg thought it hilarious and could hardly be persuaded to leave Noyo. When her trunk went overboard, many scrambled chivalrously to recover it. Less amused were Jewel survivors. 2 shipwrecks in 1 week is not fun. The fishing steamer Henrietta heard the distress signals and prudently stood well off the reef, sending a small boat through the fog to investigate. Half the survivors were taken to San Francisco aboard Henrietta, and a tug dispatched to recover and tow the wreck. And the vessel was repaired at San Francisco. I think I thought I indicated where. Well, anyway, it's sort of around here. Now, this story is called the Klamath Calamity. And, right behind me. Yeah. Doesn't look swell, does it? Our rugged north coast has had its share of shipwrecks. Somebody counted 212 from 1851 to 1956, an average of 1 every 2 weeks. They are often colorful and their stories more tolerable when no human life is lost. Hence the story of the end of the steamship Klamath. Every soul but one got safely ashore, all but Skookums, the cat. It was a dark and stormy night on the coast on February 4th, 1921, when Captain Thomas Jameson went below to his bunk, unaware that the current and an 80-mile-per-hour winds had pushed his northbound vessel perilously close to shore. The mate and helmsman on the bridge and the lookout could see little through the driving rain. Suddenly, Klamath was into the breakers with little time to reverse the engine. A knock on the rock damaged her screw propeller, and Klamath drifted helplessly in the rollers onto the rocks. In the inky blackness of midnight, reported the beacon, it was impossible to see where they were. A valiant sailor named Charles Svensson secured a rope around his waist, swam through the chilly and surging surf to shore, which was only about 50 feet away, but nobody could see. He secured a line there, and on a breeches buoy, 19 passengers landed ashore, including a sleeping 18-month-old baby, carried in a garbage can strapped to a seaman's back. A 4-horse hay wagon conveyed the passengers to Marion Filbert's house for breakfast. All of them with their luggage packed on the hay, with plucky Maid Marian at the reins. The stranded passengers would wait at Point Arena for the next northbound steamer. When the weather moderated, the curious managed to climb back aboard the wreck. A yarn tells that a gentleman was found sitting upright in his cabin doorway on the offshore side, smoking his pipe and looking out to sea. Had the gentleman, perhaps quite snoppered, not yet heard of the vessel's demise? The ship broke up spectacularly and the seas pounded her to pieces and scattered her remains along the shoreline. The ocean, claimed Schookums, who leapt overboard amidst the clamor and confusion of the catastrophe. Perhaps in Davy Jones' locker, Schookums found a heavenly cache of kitty treats, bottom feeders maybe. Okay, that happened at Del Mar, and I think that's out of county, but it's a good story. We don't get to, well, I'm not sure where Mendocino starts. Well, anyway.
Wow.
Now, this is about what it's like to steam up the coast. A story entitled "Cautiously Hugging the Coast to Casper." You go stand on the shore and look out at the Pacific Ocean. In the days before Dramamine, the ocean off the Mendocino coast was peppered with vessels. Out on the horizon, the fleet-footed vessels traveled the fast track. It was called that in those days, and they steamed between the major ports, West Coast ports. Inshore, the lane was called the low-powered steamer track. That's where steam schooners chugged along, hugging the Redwood Coast, calling in at the small ports we call dog holes, that huddled within a church bell chime of each other. Old-timers, our West Coast ancient mariners, called it the rut, a path so heavily beaten by those slowpokes, mostly the lumber schooners, steam-powered or propelled by coastal winds. Let's take a hike up the rut, as told by Captain Arvid Anderson in 1927. He was skipper of the steel steamer Casper. That's her, Casper, okay? Driven by a 3-cylinder, 700 horsepower engine, she was fleet-footed. In 1 week's time, Anderson could complete 2 round trips between the Casper Mill and the company's terminal at Pittsburgh, upriver from San Francisco. Each round trip was more than 310 nautical miles, or 357 statute miles. Casper, the third steamer to bear that name, carried up to 550,000 board feet of lumber down to Pittsburgh each trip. Now that amount of lumber you could build a little more than 20 Kelly houses. That gives you some idea of what the amount of lumber was. Northbound freight for the mill, the merchants and residents was stowed aboard the ship at Pier 17 at San Francisco, while fuel oil was pumped into her tanks. That took about 2 hours. The steamships by 1927 were virtually all oil-fired. They were no longer shoveling coal, and it eased a good bit of the labor, and also fewer crewmen, or I should say, stokers, because you only had to have one guy seeing that the oil flow was correct. You didn't have these guys shoveling coal. Okay. Just outside Golden Gate at Point Bonita, the course was set for Point Reyes, which was rounded in a stiff wind as close as 100 feet. Now that's pretty close, but I'll accept his word for it. To go around Point Reyes, this light and be just 100 feet off. Well, from Point Reyes north, there was no protection from winds, even when close to shore. But skippers would hug the beach, he said, closer than even what the government people advised. At Salt Point, the course was about 3/4 of a mile from land. When passing Del Mar, they hauled out a bit further. Then Casper's heading was altered to be straight toward Fish Rock, and passing that dangerous prominence about a half a mile out. Next, the buoy at Saunders Reef, Anderson said, was best kept 200 feet to starboard. Right side when north, that's starboard is on right side when you're going north. And if it was windy a good quarter mile, there's no protection from powerful northerly winds at Point Arena, so Anderson would keep his vessel 1.5 miles out to sea. From there they laid a course straight toward Point Cabrillo. But in genuinely heavy weather, they made for the buoy at Greenwood, Elk, and afterwards maintained a course 3/4 of a mile offshore, the rest of the way to Point Cabrillo Light. So you can see, if you followed it all, watching what's on the map. Pardon me. Okay. It was slow ahead on the engine for the short run from Cabrillo Lighthouse to the entrance of Casper Bay. In good weather, the northern run took about 11.5 to 12 hours, and ideally it was made in daylight. However, if it was dark or before 7 in the morning, they stood off the entrance to the bay and sounded the vessel's whistle, and the mill whistle sounded to acknowledge their presence. And the ship then proceeded to the mooring grounds in Casper Bay and secured to four buoys with his bow out to sea. In 1929, after Anderson took command, a bell buoy, 2 years after, a bell buoy was placed at the mouth to help vessels locate the entrance, particularly at night or in the fog. Navigating the coast at night or in fog, seafarers depended on sound. Hugging the shoreline too closely could be treacherous, and the men on the watch had to be vigilant because of those strong currents. And the breaking surf was a sound to be wary of. Each coastal lighthouse on Anderson's voyage, Point Reyes, Point Arena, and Cabrillo Light, had powerful foghorns. Their deep-throated sounds helped the crew locate their position, but sometimes the foghorns could be misleading. Atmospheric conditions distorted and confused the listener. Occasionally the sounds were muffled or could not be heard at all, even when right at hand. Once past the lighthouse and hugging close to shore, Anderson had the whistle blown every 10 minutes, and the lookouts listened to the echo bouncing off the cliffs. To further ensure safety, he kept a deckhand heaving the lead to be sure there was plenty of water beneath the keel. Vigilance ensured a safe passage and continued employment. One steam schooner skipper spoke of dog barking navigation. He became so familiar with the different barks and howls of the mutts on the coast that even in a pitch dark night he knew where he was. Gee, that's Schooner. Oh. You know. Yeah, okay. Improvisation was common among the old salts. Another skipper had a cigar box with notches to mark a few degrees, so that I can't imagine how that was marking different degrees of a circle. That would help him find the ship's position. A cigar box with notches. Very few vessels had compasses more sophisticated than the magnetic needle, let alone the newfangled, though primitive, direction finders. They were far too expensive, and management Well, you can think of what management thought, too expensive. Anyway, to depend on a compass could be folly if it was not kept scrupulously calibrated. An improper bearing was a culprit in more than one nighttime wreck on the Mendocino coast. Management said calibration was too expensive. I mean, well, let's not talk about management. So that was steam navigation on the coast from the 1880s to the 1930s. The lighthouses and foghorns were not in place all that early. The last Point Cabrillo was not operating until 1909. So, Captain Anderson quit command of Casper in 1936, and the vessel operated until March 1939, when Casper ended all waterborne transportation. Okay, now there's a story called the Seafoam Wreck. Well, that was probably the most famous vessel here in Mendocino, the vessels. There were several of them, but she was probably the most popular, and fairly comfortable accommodations, and food was good, I think. But anyway, February 23rd, 1931, well, I'll tell you the story. Gale winds of 45 miles per hour were howling in the rigging when our beloved steam schooner Seafoam, southbound for San Francisco, tried to put into Point Arena, a regular port of call for the vessel. Captain Simonson saw from the bridge that the water was far too rough to dock there, so he ordered the helmsman to come about. Her 500 horsepower engine labored as she slapped hard into the fierce seas. Point Arena is not well protected from northwest winds. Seafoam's valiant effort to make it to open sea was overwhelmed both by that irresistible current and the raging seas. The winds and seas gripped her in their fists, and despite her struggle, she was pushed sideways into deep troughs between the crests, rolling. Relentlessly, she was pushed onto the south reef. The propeller struck the rocks and was crushed. Helpless, her wooden hull was stove in, a neat nautical term for pierced. Try that sometime with your friends, stove in. Anyway, a second giant roller slammed her again against the rocks and lifted the maimed and lifeless steamer atop the reef. There she sat, amidst a maelstrom of white water churning beneath her shattered hull, while Captain Simonson and 19 crewmen gaped in amazement how fast their ship had been destroyed. Well, let's see. What shall we do? We have 7 minutes.
Open it up to questions.
Yes, yeah, please. Great thought. Thank you, Pat.
I just wanted to,
You were next.
okay.
Yes.
Oh, I just wanted to know the picture, if that had anything to do with the story you were telling about the ship.
This one?
Mm-hmm.
No, the Seafoam ended up, it was actually in pieces on the beach and rocks. But there was I could tell you that this really, while it's a really dramatic picture, has nothing to do with the Mendocino ship. But I think I liked it. And it very dramatically showed how
The captain was
quick.
from Mendocino. The
Pardon?
captain was from Mendocino.
Of the
Oh,
Seafoam?
okay.
No, of the Yosemite. The Yosemite
Yeah, the
wrecked in
Yosemite.
Point Reyes. There's an article in the back, Louis,
Oh,
a description.
oh, thank you. John Sylvia. captain. The steam schooner Yosemite, well known to many here by reason of the fact that she was captained by John Sylvia, a former well-known Mendocino boy, son of Joe Sylvia of this place. That was how they said things in those days. Fog tells the story, said Captain Sylvia. We left San Francisco at 8:30 Saturday night, bound for Point Ludlow. To pick, oh, okay, that's up in Puget Sound. To pick up a cargo of lumber at the McCormick Mills. 5 miles south of Point Reyes. Well, that puts us into, at least on the map, Point Reyes here. After standing by, oh, I lost my place. 5 miles south of Point Arena, it was so dark our lookout forward couldn't see the ship's length ahead. Then the crash came without warning and we were on the rocks. I signaled the engineer full speed astern and she backed off and I ordered all hands on deck and she began to settle rapidly. We began sending out SOS signals and I ordered the lifeboats lowered. The Willamette, another steamer, answered our signals and came to our rescue and took off the crew of 28 men. No one was lost except the ship's cat. It doesn't say what. That's different. This cat couldn't have been named Skookums, but whatever. Anyway, after standing by the wreck, the Willamette sent 3 men about the rolling hulk in a daring attempt to extinguish a flare light that was burning on deck. It was feared that it might reach the dynamite. Why do you put dynamite on a wooden ship? I mean, they used to ship a lot of cement in wooden ships. And that would make her sink like a stone. But I think I said, nobody likes fire. But if it's, on shore, run.
Nitrates was a major fall.
Nitrate?
Nitrates, bat guano. That's why
Yeah, well, it was a good fertilizer.
it was a good fertilizer,
And
but when they would get wet and they'd go down with a ship's lantern, it would explode. So they made them bag it and mark it ship high in transit.
Oh, he could, well,
But that's where the word comes from.
Oh, that's some dangerous stuff.
Ship high in transit, SHIP?
Yes.
Yeah, there you go.
well, anyway, we know that. I was trying to read what it said on this looks like a Coast Guard boat. I mean, with this
That's a
shelter.
39-footer, and if it's the one out of Point Arena, it's up at Port Orford at the, it's
The
restored
museum.
and it's at the museum there.
Well, what good, that's a good note on which to end today. That we still have, I beg your pardon. Oh, and Bruce, yes. Bill.
One question I have, I know you've researched extensively and the history here on the coast, and I've always been intrigued by a story that I heard as a child told to me by my grandmother, and I've also read just little smiddens of accounts of them, and that is 2 ships that drug anchor and were sucked into the blowhole on the south side of Mendocino Bay.
Really?
And both of them went in and never came out. And the last one was in the 1850s and the last one was in the 1890s. And my grandmother was a small child at that time and she told us the story, but then I've read also that it actually did happen. I thought it was just a tale. But as the ship went in, it came out, went in, came out, and when it came out the third time, I think there were 4 or 5 crew members and a young couple with a small child. And the woman put the child in a wooden wash tub, lashed it in and set it adrift, and the ship went in and never came out. And the baby was rescued on the beach and actually spent a year being raised by Mrs. Spencer Hills up here before the grandparent came up from Chile to retrieve it. And have you come across those accounts?
No, there are hundreds of neat stories. I mean, a lot of them right here in the archives. And I wanted to mention last. This book, which is also here in the Kelly House, it's very hard to get a hold of now. The very famous historian, Walter Jackson. And it's all at, pardon?
I have that one.
Anyway, it formed a chunk of what I was talking about today.
Sorry.
And now, yes, Bruce Levine, Arch, something or other of history.
No questions, Lloyd, but I have 2 comments.
Okay.
Now, although there are many, many, many historians all over the world who will disagree with me, but they have no proof that they're correct, whereas you might have, if I'm correct, you didn't mention the first ship, sailing ship, to ever come into Mendocino Bay, which was Francis Drake's the Golden Hind. There is no, by the way, just to tell all, there is no proof that Drake ever set foot on the west coast of North America. No tangible proof. The whole story about the Drake plate was fake, and on and on and on. But my other comment is, let's see, the bill closed down, the log boom that came down from Washington was 1938. The raft, right. Well, here we are, let's see, so that's what, 80 years later? We still have residues of that, and this story might be apocryphal, but since Nanny Escola, who was a saint, told it to me, I'm going to take it as truth. And that is that there were no earwigs in Mendocino until after that log boom was log raft.
Well, as they say on the comedy stage, leave them laughing. So thank you very much.
Put your cup in here and we'll throw it away.
Thank you.
My dad, he leased the land at my big river in Mendocino Lumber Company years ago. So, started right across from where Skip used to have a candle shop, before Fort Hough, all the way down, there were capitals.
Mix? To sign away his right to that parcel. A great granddaughter of Otis said that she spent a lot of time in the mansion. At least as long as she was in Francisco. At least basically gave her mansion.